The theater was already loud before the show even began. Bright lights flashed across the stage while workers hurried from one side to another carrying microphones, music stands, and cables. Contestants stood backstage practicing their routines one last time. Some singers warmed up their voices loudly while dancers stretched near the walls. The audience inside the building buzzed with excitement, hoping to see something unforgettable that night. Near the back entrance, a woman stepped quietly into the theater, holding a small black bag close to her side. Unlike the others, she did not arrive with friends or family cheering for her. She walked slowly through the hallway, trying not to draw attention to herself. Her clothes were simple, her shoes slightly worn, and her nervous eyes moved carefully around the crowded room. At the registration desk, one of the volunteers looked up at her. "Performer?" the volunteer asked kindly. The woman nodded softly and handed over her paper. The volunteer checked the list. "Piano performance?" "Yes," she answered quietly. The volunteer smiled politely and pointed toward the backstage waiting area. "You'll probably go on later tonight. We're running behind already." The woman thanked her and walked away, gripping her bag a little tighter. Backstage was full of energy, but she seemed completely separate from it. Groups of performers laughed together while others filmed videos for social media. Several contestants wore sparkling outfits covered in bright colors. Some looked extremely confident, already acting like winners before the competition even started. The woman found an empty chair near the corner and sat down silently. She placed her bag beside her feet and watched the stage curtain move slightly every time someone entered or exited. A pair of contestants nearby glanced toward her. "She's performing?" one whispered quietly. "I guess so," the other replied. "Maybe she's somebody's piano teacher." They laughed softly before returning to their conversation. The woman heard them, but she pretended not to notice. She had grown used to people making quick judgments long ago. She slowly opened her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old and slightly wrinkled from being carried around for years. On the page were handwritten music notes faded by time. She stared at them for a moment, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the paper. A stage worker walked past and stopped beside her. "You okay?" he asked gently. She gave a nervous smile. "Just trying to stay calm. Big crowd tonight," he said. "But don't worry too much. Most people are supportive." She nodded politely, though her hands still trembled slightly. The truth was, she had almost turned around and gone home 3 different times before arriving at the theater. Earlier that morning, she had stood outside the building for nearly 10 minutes staring at the entrance. Every doubt she carried seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. She kept thinking about how long it had been since she last performed in front of people. Years. Too many years. Most days of her life followed the same routine now. Wake up early. Work long hours at a small restaurant. Return home exhausted. Take care of her elderly father. Sleep for a few hours. Repeat everything again the next day. Music had once been the center of her world, but life slowly pushed it further away year after year. Still, something inside her refused to let it disappear completely. Backstage, applause suddenly exploded from the theater as another performer finished singing. The loud reaction pulled her back into the present moment. One contestant rolled her eyes dramatically after hearing the applause. "These judges love emotional performances," she complained. "You don't even need real talent anymore." Several others laughed in agreement. The woman lowered her eyes quietly. She did not know if she belonged there anymore. Looking around at the younger, more confident performers only made her doubts stronger. A few minutes later, the host's voice echoed through the theater speakers. "Let's keep the energy going tonight." The crowd cheered loudly. Another contestant was called onto the stage while workers backstage rushed around preparing props and microphones. The woman remained seated silently, almost invisible among the chaos. As time passed, the theater grew warmer and louder. Some performances impressed the audience, but others fell flat. A comedian forgot part of his routine halfway through. A dance group struggled with timing. One singer became so nervous that her voice cracked during the high notes. Slowly, The audience's excitement began fading. People started checking their phones. Some whispered during performances. A few even walked toward the exits for snacks and drinks. Backstage, the woman quietly watched everything unfold while holding the folded music paper in her lap. Her thoughts drifted back many years earlier. She remembered being a little girl sitting beside an old piano in a tiny apartment. Her mother used to hum softly while cooking dinner nearby. Every evening, the sound of piano notes filled their small home. Even during difficult times, music somehow made everything feel lighter. Her first piano teacher noticed her talent quickly. By the age of 12, she could play songs far beyond her age level. Neighbors sometimes gathered outside their apartment door just to listen to her practice. People often told her she had a special gift. For a while, she believed her future would always include music. But life rarely follows the plans people make. As she grew older, money problems became worse inside the family. Medical bills piled up. Her father worked endless hours, but it was never enough. Then her mother became seriously ill. Everything changed after that. Dreams slowly turned into responsibilities. The memory faded as a loud voice interrupted backstage again. 5 performers until piano act, a crew member shouted. The woman's stomach tightened instantly. She stood up and walked carefully toward the side of the stage curtain. From there, she could see part of the audience. The theater was much fuller than she expected. Hundreds of faces looked toward the stage under dim golden lights. She suddenly felt very small. For a brief moment, she considered leaving. Nobody knew her there. Nobody expected anything from her. She could quietly walk out the back door and return home before anyone noticed. But then she remembered something her mother once told her long ago. If music lives inside you, it never truly leaves. The memory stayed with her. One performer after another finished their act. Applause came and went. The host kept trying to lift the crowd's energy, but exhaustion was beginning to settle across the theater. Finally, a stage assistant approached her. "You're next." Her heart pounded hard against her chest. The assistant gave her a small, encouraging smile. "Take your time." She nodded slowly. As the previous performer exited the stage, workers rolled out an old piano beneath the spotlight. The instrument looked slightly worn, with scratches visible along the edges. It was not beautiful or polished like concert hall pianos, but the moment she saw it, something calm settled inside her. The host stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Our next performer will present a piano piece for us tonight." A few polite claps came from the audience. The host read her name from the card before stepping aside. Backstage became silent around her. She inhaled deeply once, then walked toward the light. The bright stage lamps hit her eyes immediately as she stepped into view. For a second, the size of the crowd almost froze her in place. The applause was weak compared to earlier performances. Some audience members barely looked up. A man near the middle row continued checking his phone. 2 teenagers whispered to each other while laughing quietly. Near the back, someone yawned openly. The woman walked carefully toward the piano bench and sat down slowly. The giant theater suddenly felt painfully quiet. She stared down at the piano keys without touching them. 1 second passed. Then another. The audience waited awkwardly. A few people shifted impatiently in their seats. Backstage, one contestant crossed her arms and whispered, "Is she even going to start?" The woman's fingers hovered slightly above the keys. Her breathing trembled. For one terrifying moment, every fear inside her returned at once. Fear of failure. Fear of embarrassment. Fear that maybe the world she once loved had moved on without her. Then she quietly closed her eyes. And finally, her fingers touched the piano. The very first note floated softly through the theater like a whisper. The second note followed. Then another. Within seconds, the atmosphere inside the room changed completely. The conversations stopped. The man holding his phone slowly lowered it. The teenagers stopped whispering. Even backstage, performers turned toward the curtain in surprise. The music was gentle, but deeply emotional. Every note carried something raw and honest that no flashy performance earlier that night had managed to create. The woman kept playing quietly, her hands moving with growing confidence across the worn piano keys. And little by little, the entire theater became completely still. The piano notes continued flowing gently through the theater, and with every passing second, the atmosphere inside the room changed more deeply. The audience that had once seemed tired and distracted now sat completely still. Even the workers backstage stopped moving around as much. It was as if the entire building had quietly agreed to listen. The woman kept her eyes lowered toward the piano keys, while her fingers moved carefully across them. There was no dramatic performance, no flashy movements, no attempt to impress anyone. Yet somehow, the emotion inside the music reached every corner of the theater. Near the front row, one of the judges slowly leaned forward in his chair. Another judge whispered softly, "Where did she come from?" The first judge shook his head without taking his eyes off the stage. "I have no idea." The melody slowly grew stronger. Not louder, but deeper. Every note carried warmth, sadness, and hope all at once. Some people in the audience could not even explain why they suddenly felt emotional. A woman sitting near the aisle quietly wiped her eyes. An older man folded his arms tightly as he stared toward the stage, completely lost in thought. Even the teenagers who had laughed earlier now sat silently watching the performance without blinking much. Backstage, several contestants stood near the curtain in complete surprise. "That's the same woman from earlier?" one whispered. Another nodded slowly. "I didn't expect this at all." The woman continued playing, unaware of the effect she was having on everyone around her. For the first time that night, her nervousness slowly disappeared. The moment her hands touched the piano, something inside her had awakened again. Felt familiar, safe, like returning to a place she had missed for years. As the music filled the theater, memories quietly rose inside her mind. She remembered sitting beside her mother late at night while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. Their home had been small, and money had always been tight, but music somehow made those difficult evenings feel peaceful. Her mother loved listening to her practice. Sometimes after long days, her mother would sit quietly nearby with tired eyes and simply smile while the piano played. "You speak through music," she used to say softly, "even when you don't speak with words." Back then, the woman dreamed of performing in large concert halls someday. Her teachers believed she had real talent. By the time she was 16, she had already won several local competitions. People around her often said she had a bright future ahead. Then life changed faster than anyone expected. Her mother became ill very suddenly. At first, doctors believed treatment would help, but months passed and the situation only became worse. Medical bills grew larger. Her father worked longer hours every week, returning home exhausted and silent. The piano remained inside the apartment, but slowly the music stopped filling the rooms as often. There were more important things to worry about now. One evening, while practicing quietly, she overheard her parents talking in the kitchen. "We can't keep up with the bills," her father had whispered heavily. The silence that followed felt unbearable. A few days later, the piano was sold. She still remembered watching strangers carry it out of their apartment while her mother stood nearby pretending to stay strong. The empty space left behind felt colder than she could explain. That was the first time she truly understood what sacrifice meant. Back in the theater, her hands continued moving gently across the worn piano keys. The music shifted into a softer section, almost fragile in its emotion. The audience leaned in even closer, afraid to miss a single note. The host stood near the side of the stage completely speechless. Usually during performances, he checked his notes or prepared announcements for the next act. But now he simply listened quietly like everyone else. One of the camera operators slowly zoomed closer toward the woman's face. Her expression carried no pride or performance energy. It looked deeply personal, almost as though she had forgotten the audience existed at all. Near the back row, a little girl around 10 years old sat staring at the stage with wide eyes. She had attended the event with her older sister and spent most of the night looking bored earlier. But now she sat perfectly still. "She's amazing," the girl whispered softly. Her sister nodded without taking her eyes off the stage. The woman playing the piano never noticed any of this. At that moment, she was somewhere between the present and the past. After her mother passed away years earlier, everything inside their home changed. Her father became quieter. Smiles disappeared from daily life. Bills continued piling up, and dreams slowly faded beneath responsibility. Instead of attending music school like she once planned, she began working. First small jobs, then longer hours, then full-time work. 1 year turned into another. Sometimes she passed music stores and paused outside the windows for a few seconds before continuing home. Occasionally she heard piano music drifting from restaurants or hotels and felt something painful deep inside her chest. But she never fully abandoned music. Late at night after finishing work, she sometimes visited a small church a few streets away from her apartment. The building stayed mostly empty during weekdays. An old piano sat quietly near the front wall covered in dust. One evening, she carefully touched the keys when nobody was around. The pastor heard the music echoing through the church and walked inside expecting to find a professional musician. Instead, he found a tired young woman sitting alone in the dim light playing, as if she were pouring years of hidden emotion into every note. After that night, he quietly allowed her to return whenever she wanted. For years, the church became the only place where she truly felt connected to herself again. No audience, no pressure, just music. Back in the theater, the performance slowly built toward something more powerful. The audience could feel it coming. The melody rose higher with growing emotion, yet still remained graceful and controlled. Her fingers moved faster now, but every note stayed clear and meaningful. Several audience members were openly crying. One judge pressed his lips together tightly while staring down at the table for a moment, clearly emotional himself. "This is unbelievable," he murmured quietly. Backstage, the same contestants who once judged her now looked almost embarrassed by their earlier comments. "She doesn't even look nervous anymore," one whispered. Another shook her head slowly. "It's like she belongs up there." The woman's hands glided across the piano keys with complete focus now. The worn instrument that once seemed ordinary suddenly sounded alive beneath her touch. The theater no longer felt like a talent show. Felt like something far more real. The audience was not simply hearing music. They were feeling a person's entire life through it. Pain, loss, loneliness, hope, strength. Every emotion seemed to exist inside the melody. As the final section approached, the woman closed her eyes briefly while continuing to play. The movement looked natural, almost unconscious. For a few seconds, she seemed completely lost inside the music itself. The final notes began softly, then slowly rose into one powerful emotional finish that echoed through the silent theater. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The last note lingered in the air for one long breath. Then complete silence filled the room. For half a second, it almost seemed like the audience had forgotten how to react. And then suddenly, the entire theater exploded with applause. People jumped to their feet almost instantly. Cheers echoed through the building from every direction. Several audience members clapped so hard their hands hurt, but nobody wanted to stop. The judges stood up too. One of them shook his head in disbelief while applauding. The little girl near the front row smiled so widely her eyes filled with tears. Backstage, contestants stared toward the stage with open shock. The woman slowly lifted her hands away from the piano keys and looked up for the first time since the performance began. Her expression was filled with confusion and emotion, as though she could hardly believe what was happening around her. The standing ovation continued growing louder. And for the first time in many years, she realized that the dream she buried long ago might not have disappeared after all. The applause inside the theater refused to die down. People remained standing, clapping harder than they had for any performer that night. Some audience members even whistled loudly, while others shouted words of praise toward the stage. The woman stayed seated at the piano for a few seconds longer, completely overwhelmed by the reaction around her. Her chest rose and fell quickly as she tried to steady her breathing. She had imagined many possible endings before walking onto that stage earlier that night, but none of them looked anything like this. Slowly, she stood up from the piano bench. The moment she rose to her feet, the crowd cheered even louder. The bright stage lights reflected against her watery eyes. She pressed her lips together tightly, trying to stop her emotions from showing too much. For years, she had hidden most of her feelings behind quiet routines and long workdays. Now hundreds of strangers stood before her applauding, as if they somehow understood everything she had carried inside. Near the judges' table, one of the judges shook his head slowly while continuing to clap. "That wasn't just talent," he said quietly. "That was life." Another judge nodded in agreement. "You can't teach emotion like that." The host finally walked back onto the stage, smiling in complete disbelief. "Wow," he said into the microphone while the applause continued around him. "I think everyone here just experienced something very special tonight." The crowd cheered again. The woman lowered her head modestly, clearly uncomfortable with so much attention focused on her. The host turned toward her. "How are you feeling right now?" She gave a nervous laugh under her breath. "Honestly, a little shocked." The audience laughed softly with her. "You should be proud," the host replied warmly. "That performance touched everyone in this room." The woman looked down for a second before answering quietly. "Thank you." The host paused for a moment, then asked, "Have you performed professionally before?" She hesitated. The theater became silent again, waiting for her answer. "A long time ago," she finally said softly. "Not anymore." There was something about the way she answered that immediately made people curious. Her voice carried no bitterness, only honesty. One of the judges leaned toward his microphone. "You play with the kind of emotion people spend years trying to learn," he said. "Where did that come from?" The woman stood still under the stage lights for a moment. She looked toward the piano beside her before answering. "Life," she said quietly. The single word filled the room with silence. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The honesty in her voice hit harder than any dramatic speech could have. The judge slowly nodded with deep respect. The host spoke again carefully this time. "Well, whatever journey brought you here tonight, we're very grateful you decided to walk onto this stage." The audience applauded once more. The woman thanked them softly before stepping away from the microphone. As she walked backstage, people near the curtain stared at her differently now. Earlier, many barely noticed her. Now every face carried curiosity, respect, or shock. Several contestants immediately approached her. "That was incredible," one singer said honestly. Another performer shook her head in disbelief. "I've never heard anything like that before." The woman smiled politely but still looked overwhelmed by the attention. Then one of the contestants who had whispered about her earlier stepped forward awkwardly. "I just wanted to say sorry," she admitted quietly. "I judged you before I even heard you play." The woman blinked in surprise. "You don't need to apologize," she said gently. "No, I do," the contestant replied honestly. "I thought you were just another random performer." The woman gave a small understanding smile. "It's okay." There was no anger in her voice, no pride either. That somehow made the moment feel even more genuine. Backstage workers continued talking excitedly about the performance while preparing for the next act. Even people who normally stayed calm during events seemed unusually emotional. One camera operator walked past shaking his head. "That performance is going online tonight," he said to another worker. "People are going to lose their minds over it." The woman overheard him but paid little attention. Social media was the last thing on her mind. Right now she only wanted a quiet place to breathe. She stepped into an empty hallway near the dressing rooms and leaned lightly against the wall. The loud applause from the theater still echoed faintly in the distance. For a long moment, she simply stood there trying to process everything. Her hands still trembled slightly from the performance. Then her phone buzzed inside her bag. She pulled it out and saw a message from her father. "How did it go?" She stared at the screen for a few seconds before smiling softly. "Better than I expected," she typed back. A few seconds later another message appeared. "I knew it would." Her eyes watered again instantly. She quickly locked the phone before emotions completely overwhelmed her. Back inside the theater, the competition continued, but something had clearly changed after her performance. The audience reacted politely to the next acts, yet the energy felt different now. People continued whispering about the piano performance between every segment. Near the middle rows, several audience members were already searching online for clips from the show. One man turned his phone toward his friend. "Look, somebody already uploaded part of it." The short video showed only the final minute of her performance, but even that small clip was quickly gaining views. Comments began appearing almost immediately. "Who is she? This gave me chills. I haven't cried during music in years. She deserves a bigger stage." Backstage, the woman remained unaware that her performance was already spreading online. She quietly gathered her things near the corner chair where she had sat earlier that evening. The old folded music paper still rested inside her bag. She carefully placed it back between the pages of a notebook before zipping the bag closed. The same stage worker from earlier walked over carrying 2 paper cups. "Thought you might need this," he said kindly, handing her a warm drink. She smiled gratefully. "Thank you." He leaned against the wall nearby. "You know everybody backstage is talking about you now, right?" She laughed nervously. "That's a little hard to believe." "No, seriously," he replied. "I've worked these events for years. I've never seen a crowd react like that." She lowered her eyes modestly. "I almost didn't come tonight," she admitted quietly. "Well," he said with a smile, "that would have been a huge mistake." For the first time all evening, she laughed a little more naturally. A few moments later, one of the event organizers hurried toward her holding a clipboard. "There you are," the organizer said breathlessly. "The judges want you back on stage before the final results." The woman looked surprised. "Why?" "They want to speak with you again." Her nervousness immediately returned. A few minutes later, she stood once more beneath the bright stage lights as the audience welcomed her back with loud applause. The host smiled warmly. "Looks like people weren't ready for you to leave just yet." The crowd cheered again. One judge leaned toward his microphone. "There's something important I want to say," he began. "Talent competitions usually focus on technique, perfection, and performance quality. But every once in a while, someone reminds us why music exists in the first place." The theater became completely silent. The judge continued carefully. "Music is supposed to make people feel something. Tonight you did exactly that." The audience erupted into applause again. The woman pressed her hand lightly against her chest, visibly emotional. Another judge spoke next. "You may not realize this yet, but I think your performance tonight is going to stay with people for a very long time." Those words lingered heavily in the room, because somehow, everyone already sensed they were true. After the event finally ended later that night, the woman slipped quietly out of the theater through a side exit. The cool night air felt calming after the overwhelming energy inside the building. The streets outside were mostly quiet now. She began walking toward the bus stop, holding her bag close against her shoulder. Cars passed slowly through the dark streets while city lights reflected across wet pavement from earlier rain. For the first time in years, her heart felt strangely light. Not because of applause, not because strangers praised her, but because for a few brief minutes on that stage she had finally felt like herself again. When she reached home later that night, her father was awake waiting in the small living room. The television was still on quietly in the corner. The moment she stepped through the door, he looked up immediately. "Well?" he asked softly. She smiled tiredly. "I think it went okay." He studied her face carefully for a second before smiling too. "No," he said gently. "I think something changed tonight." She sat beside him quietly while exhaustion slowly settled over her. Neither of them noticed that online, thousands of people were already sharing clips of her performance across social media. And with every passing hour, more strangers around the world were pressing play. The next morning began like every other normal day in her small apartment. The woman woke before sunrise, moved quietly through the kitchen, and prepared tea while the city outside slowly came to life. Her father sat near the window wrapped in a light sweater, reading yesterday's newspaper with tired eyes. Neither of them spoke much at first. The previous night still felt unreal. Part of her wondered if the whole thing had simply been an emotional moment that people would quickly forget by morning. She poured tea into 2 cups and placed one carefully beside her father. "You should rest today," he said gently. She gave a tired smile. "I still have work." Before he could answer, her phone suddenly buzzed across the table. Then buzzed again. And again. She frowned slightly. By the time she picked it up, the screen was already filled with missed calls, messages, and notifications. Her eyes widened in confusion as more alerts continued appearing every second. "What happened?" her father asked. I don't know." She opened one message from an old coworker she had not spoken to in years. "I just saw your performance online. Is that really you?" Another message appeared from someone else. "You're everywhere right now." A third message followed almost immediately. "That piano performance made me cry." The woman stared at the screen in disbelief. Her hands slowly tightened around the phone. Then she opened social media. For a few seconds, she simply froze. Clips from the performance covered her entire screen. Different accounts had reposted the video overnight. Some clips already had millions of views. Thousands of comments poured in beneath them every minute. "Who is this woman? This is the most emotional performance I've seen in years. You can feel every note. She deserves a standing ovation forever. I watched this 5 times already." Her heart pounded harder with every comment she read. Her father quietly stood and walked closer behind her shoulder. When he saw the screen, even he looked stunned. "They really loved your performance," he whispered softly. The woman shook her head slowly, unable to process any of it. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured. But the notifications kept coming. News pages were reposting clips. Music pages were sharing reactions. People from different countries were leaving emotional comments under the videos. One short clip showing her final piano notes had already been viewed millions of times overnight. She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Her father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You touched people," he said quietly. "That's why they're sharing it." The woman looked down silently. For years she had lived almost invisibly. Most days passed without anyone noticing her at all. She worked long hours, returned home exhausted, and repeated the same routine again the next morning. Now suddenly strangers everywhere were talking about her. It felt impossible. Her phone rang again. This time it was her manager from the restaurant. For one nervous second, she worried she had somehow done something wrong. She answered quickly. "Hello. Why didn't you tell us you could play like that?" Her manager almost shouted through the phone. The woman blinked in surprise. "You saw it. Everyone saw it," he replied. "The entire restaurant staff is talking about you right now." She laughed nervously under her breath. "I didn't think it was a big deal." "A big deal?" he repeated loudly. "People are posting your performance everywhere." For the first time since waking up, the woman smiled a little more naturally. Her manager spoke again, softer this time. "You should be proud of yourself." The words stayed with her long after the call ended. Later that morning, she left for work carrying a strange nervousness inside her chest. Part of her hoped nobody would recognize her outside. That hope disappeared almost immediately. As soon as she entered the restaurant, several employees turned toward her at once. "There she is." One coworker hurried over holding up a phone. "We watched your performance during break." Another shook her head in disbelief. "Why didn't you ever tell us you could play piano like that?" The woman felt heat rush into her face. She laughed awkwardly. "I don't know. It just never came up." Customers began recognizing her too. One older woman stopped her near a table. "I saw your performance last night," she said warmly. "Thank you." The woman looked surprised. "Thank you for watching." The customer smiled gently. "No. Thank you for reminding people that real emotion still matters." The simple comment affected her more deeply than expected. Throughout the day, more customers mentioned the performance. Some asked for pictures. Others simply wanted to shake her hand or tell her how emotional the music made them feel. Between orders and long shifts, she quietly checked her phone again. The numbers kept rising. Millions of views, thousands of shares, hundreds of messages from strangers. Some messages were short and simple. Your music helped me today. I lost my mother years ago. Your performance reminded me of her. I haven't touched my piano in 10 years. Tonight, I'm going to play again. Reading those messages affected her deeply because she understood pain hidden behind quiet words better than most people. That evening after work, she walked home slowly through crowded streets. The city lights reflected across the sidewalks while cool air moved gently through the buildings. Her life looked exactly the same around her. But inside, everything felt different now. When she reached home, she found her father sitting in front of the television again. This time, her performance was playing on the screen. A local news program had featured the video. The television host spoke excitedly about the unknown pianist who moved millions overnight. The woman immediately covered her face in embarrassment. Her father laughed softly for the first time in a long while. "You're famous now," he teased gently. She shook her head quickly. "No, this will disappear in a few days." But even as she said it, more messages continued arriving. The next few days became even stranger. Interview requests started appearing in her email. Local radio stations wanted to speak with her. Music bloggers asked questions about her life story. One respected pianist even shared her video online with the caption, "Technique can be learned. Emotion like this cannot." The post spread rapidly. People became even more curious about the quiet woman behind the performance. Still, despite all the attention, she remained deeply uncomfortable with fame. Every interview request made her nervous. Every compliment felt difficult to accept. Part of her still saw herself as the tired restaurant worker who practiced secretly inside an empty church late at night. One afternoon, while scrolling through comments online, she suddenly found a cruel message buried among thousands of supportive ones. She only went viral because people feel sorry for her. Her expression changed instantly. A second comment appeared nearby. "She probably won't be remembered in a month." The words hit harder than she expected. For years, self-doubt had lived quietly inside her. Even after the standing ovation, part of her still feared she wasn't truly good enough. Her father noticed the sadness on her face later that evening. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. She hesitated before handing him the phone. He read the comments silently, then looked back at her calmly. "You know something?" he said. "What?" "People who are touched by something real will always remember it." She lowered her eyes quietly. "But what if they're right?" she admitted softly. "What if this was just one lucky moment?" Her father stared at her carefully for a second. Then he spoke words she never expected to hear from him. "I think I'm the one who should apologize." She looked up immediately. "For what?" He sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. "For letting life take music away from you." The room became completely quiet. "You gave up your dreams because this family was struggling," he continued softly. "And I watched it happen." Emotion filled her chest instantly. "You don't have to say that," she whispered. "But it's true." His voice trembled slightly now. "When they carried your piano out of the apartment years ago, I still remember the look on your face." Tears slowly filled her eyes. For years, neither of them had spoken openly about those difficult times. Her father looked down at his hands quietly. "I always wondered what your life would have looked like if things had been different." The woman moved closer and gently held his hand. "I never blamed you," she said softly. He looked at her with emotional eyes. "You still should have had the chance to follow your dream." She smiled sadly. "Maybe I'm finally getting that chance now." The words hung softly between them. A few days later, another message arrived in her inbox. This one was different. It was an invitation to perform at a large charity concert in the city. Famous musicians and respected performers would attend the event, along with reporters and important guests. At the bottom of the message was a simple sentence. "Your performance reminded people why music matters." She read the invitation 3 times silently. Then she slowly lowered the phone. Fear immediately returned to her chest. The first performance had happened naturally. She never expected attention, pressure, or millions of people watching online. But this would be different. Now people expected something from her. Now they would compare, judge, watch carefully. Her hands suddenly felt cold again. That night, long after her father went to sleep, she sat alone near the apartment window staring down at the glowing city streets below. The invitation rested quietly beside her. Outside, the world continued moving normally. Cars passed. Lights flickered. Rain tapped gently against the glass. And deep inside, the same question repeated itself over and over again. Could she really step onto a stage like that again? For several days, the invitation remained untouched on the small table beside her window. Every morning before leaving for work, the woman glanced at it briefly. Every night when she returned home exhausted, it was still there waiting for her decision. The charity concert was only 2 weeks away now. Her phone continued buzzing constantly with messages, interview requests, and comments from strangers online. Some people praised her endlessly while others questioned whether she could ever deliver another performance as emotional as the first one. At first, she tried ignoring the pressure. But slowly, the fear began creeping deeper into her thoughts. What if the first performance had only been a lucky moment? What if people expected something impossible now? The questions followed her everywhere. One evening after work, she finally opened the email again and read the invitation carefully from beginning to end. The concert would take place in one of the largest music halls in the city. Well-known musicians, reporters, and special guests would attend. Her stomach tightened just imagining it. Her father watched quietly from the other side of the room. "You still haven't answered them?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "I don't know if I can do it." "You can. This is different," she whispered. "Last time nobody expected anything from me." Her father studied her carefully. "And now people are waiting for me to be extraordinary." The room fell quiet. Deep down, she feared disappointing everyone who believed in her. But even more than that, she feared disappointing herself. A few days later, she finally accepted the invitation. The moment she sent the reply, panic immediately rushed through her chest. The concert organizers responded within minutes, excited to confirm her appearance. Now there was no turning back. Soon rehearsals began. The first rehearsal took place inside the massive concert hall where the event would happen. The moment she stepped inside, she nearly froze. The building was beautiful but intimidating. Giant lights hung high above the stage. Rows upon rows of empty seats stretched across the enormous room. Workers moved equipment everywhere while famous performers rehearsed under bright spotlights. The woman suddenly felt very small again. A staff member guided her toward the piano waiting center stage. "We're so happy you agreed to perform," the organizer said warmly. She smiled nervously. "Thank you for inviting me." Several musicians nearby recognized her immediately. One singer approached her with a smile. "Your video was everywhere online." Another performer added, "That performance was incredible." The woman thanked them politely, but nervousness continued building inside her. When rehearsal finally began, things did not go the way she hoped. Her fingers felt stiff. She missed notes she normally played easily. Twice she lost focus completely and had to stop halfway through the piece. The empty concert hall suddenly felt colder with every mistake. One organizer quietly whispered something to another person near the stage. Though she could not hear the words clearly, she imagined the worst immediately. Maybe they regretted inviting her. Maybe everyone expected more. By the end of rehearsal, her confidence had dropped badly. "You okay?" one technician asked kindly as she stepped away from the piano. She forced a small smile. "Just nervous." "Honestly," he replied, "everyone gets nervous in this place." But his words did little to calm her. That night she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined herself freezing on stage in front of thousands of people. She pictured disappointed faces, embarrassing mistakes, headlines online saying she failed to live up to expectations. The fear became so heavy that by morning, she considered canceling entirely. At work later that day, even simple tasks became difficult because her mind kept drifting back to the concert. One customer recognized her from the viral video and smiled warmly. "We're excited to watch your next performance," he said. The woman thanked him politely, but inside she felt even more pressure. Everyone expected another unforgettable moment. What if she could not give them one? That evening after work, instead of going straight home, she found herself walking familiar streets without fully thinking about where she was headed. Eventually, she stopped in front of the small church where she used to practice late at night. The building looked exactly the same. Quiet, simple, peaceful. For a moment, she just stood outside staring at the doors while memories flooded back. Then she slowly walked inside. The church was nearly empty except for a few candles glowing softly near the front. The old piano still rested in the same place beneath the dim lights. Dust floated quietly through the air. The pastor looked up from nearby chairs and smiled immediately when he saw her. "I had a feeling you might come tonight," he said gently. She laughed softly. "Was it that obvious? You only come here when something is heavy on your mind." The woman sat slowly at the piano bench. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then finally she admitted the truth. "I'm scared." The pastor pulled up a nearby chair and sat quietly beside the piano. "Of what?" She stared down at the keys. "What if that first performance was the only special thing I had left?" The pastor remained silent for a moment before answering. "You know what people connected with that night?" She shook her head slightly. "It wasn't perfection," he said softly. "It was honesty." The words settled deeply inside her. "You weren't trying to impress anyone. You were simply playing from your heart." She looked down quietly. "But now everybody expects something." The pastor smiled gently. "Then forget everybody for a little while." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Play for the same reason you used to play here." The woman's eyes slowly moved around the empty church. Late nights practicing alone. No audience. No pressure. No expectations. Just music. The pastor leaned back calmly. "Fame changes people when they start chasing applause instead of truth." The room became silent again. Then the woman slowly placed her hands on the old piano keys. At first she played softly. Simple notes. Gentle melodies. No performance energy. No attempt to impress anyone. And little by little, the tension inside her chest began fading. For over an hour, she played quietly inside the empty church while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. By the end, her breathing had finally slowed. The fear had not disappeared completely, but something more important returned. Peace. The night of the charity concert arrived faster than expected. Backstage, the giant venue buzzed with nervous energy. Performers hurried between dressing rooms while workers checked lights, cameras, and microphones. The sound of the audience echoed faintly through the walls as thousands of people filled the seats outside. The woman stood quietly near a hallway mirror, adjusting her sleeves with trembling hands. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. A stage assistant approached with a clipboard. "You'll go on in about 15 minutes." She nodded silently. Nearby television screens showed the live audience entering the massive concert hall. Every seat looked full. The pressure returned instantly. What if she failed in front of all those people? She closed her eyes briefly and tried controlling her breathing. Then suddenly, movement near the hallway caught her attention. A young girl stood nearby holding the hand of an older woman. The woman recognized her immediately. It was the little girl from the first theater performance. The child's eyes widened with excitement. "You're the piano lady," she whispered happily. The woman laughed softly despite her nerves. The girl smiled brightly. "I watched your video every day." Those simple words touched her deeply. "You did?" the woman asked gently. The girl nodded quickly. "I started learning piano because of you." For a moment, the noise backstage seemed to disappear completely. The woman stared at the child in surprise. The girl continued smiling with complete innocence and admiration. And suddenly, the woman remembered something important. This was never really about fame or critics. or expectations. It was about connection, hope, honesty. The same things she felt while playing alone inside the church years earlier. A stage worker appeared beside them. It's time. Her stomach tightened again. But this time, the fear no longer controlled her completely. The woman took one deep breath before stepping toward the stage entrance. The giant crowd beyond the curtain roared loudly as the previous performer finished. Bright lights spilled across the floor ahead of her. Then slowly, with steady hands and a calmer heart, she walked toward the stage once again. The noise from the audience grew louder as the woman stepped closer to the stage entrance. Bright white lights spilled across the floor ahead of her, while the host announced her name to thousands of people waiting inside the concert hall. Backstage workers moved quickly around her, but their voices sounded distant now. Her heart still pounded hard. But something inside her had changed after speaking to the little girl moments earlier. The fear was still there. The pressure was still real. Yet beneath all of it, she remembered why she first fell in love with music long ago. Not for applause, not for fame, but because music gave people comfort when words could not. The stage assistant gave her a gentle nod. "You're ready." The woman inhaled slowly and stepped forward. The crowd applauded warmly as she walked onto the giant stage. Cameras immediately turned toward her while soft lights followed her movement across the polished floor. The concert hall was far larger than the small theater where everything began weeks earlier. Thousands of faces filled the darkened seats ahead of her. Some people held phones ready to record, while others leaned forward with curiosity and excitement. Many already knew her story. Many came specifically to hear her play. For one brief second, the size of the moment almost overwhelmed her again. Then she noticed something near the front row. The little girl sat there smiling brightly beside her family. The innocent excitement in the child's eyes calmed her immediately. The woman smiled softly back before reaching the piano bench. The giant black piano stood beneath the spotlight waiting silently. She sat down carefully. The entire concert hall slowly became quiet. Somewhere high above the stage, cameras zoomed closer. Reporters waited nearby. Famous performers watched from backstage screens. But the woman no longer focused on any of them. She placed her trembling hands lightly above the keys, then closed her eyes for one small moment, and began to play. The first notes floated gently through the massive hall. Soft, simple, honest. The crowd became completely silent almost instantly. The woman let the music guide her naturally instead of forcing perfection. Her fingers moved carefully across the piano while emotion slowly filled every note. This performance felt different from the first one. That night in the small theater, the music carried years of hidden pain and forgotten dreams. Tonight, the music carried something else too. Healing, hope, strength. The giant hall seemed to shrink around the sound of the piano. Thousands of people listened so quietly that even the smallest notes echoed clearly through the room. Several audience members lowered their phones after a few moments, choosing simply to listen instead of recording. Near the side stage, one famous singer stood with folded arms and emotional eyes. "She's doing it again," he whispered softly. Back at the piano, the woman no longer looked nervous. The fear that had haunted her during rehearsals disappeared note by note. She stopped worrying about critics, expectations, and comparisons. She simply played. And somehow that made the performance even more powerful. The melody slowly built into something deeper and more emotional. Every section felt personal without needing words to explain anything. People in the audience reacted quietly in different ways. Some closed their eyes while listening. Others wiped tears from their faces. One older man pressed a hand against his chest as if the music had unlocked memories he had not visited in years. Near the front row, the little girl stared at the stage with complete admiration. The woman's hands moved with growing confidence now. Her body relaxed naturally into the music as though the piano had become part of her once again. For the first time in many years, she no longer felt like someone who lost her dream. She felt like herself. Backstage, concert organizers exchanged stunned looks. One whispered quietly, "This is even stronger than the viral performance." Another nodded slowly. because now she believes in herself. As the music reached its emotional center, memories quietly passed through the woman's mind while she played. Long nights inside the empty church. Her mother smiling softly while listening from the kitchen years ago. Her father carrying heavy worries silently through difficult times. The old piano being taken from their apartment. Lonely evenings after work. Fear. Sacrifice. Hope. Every part of her journey somehow lived inside the melody. And the audience could feel it. By the time she reached the final section, many people were openly crying. The concert hall remained perfectly still except for the sound of the piano. Then came the final notes, soft at first, then rising gently into one final emotional finish that echoed beautifully across the entire building. The last note lingered in the air. Silence followed. One breath, two breaths, then suddenly, the entire hall exploded with applause. Thousands of people rose to their feet at once.